remember how you held me then? Now you got me reaching out. And do you see you got me falling in more times than I can get out. Down in the deep of my mind, I crawl for you and you're always inside. Down in the deep of my mind, how long do I got to keep you, to keep you? Down in the deep of my mind, I crawl for you and you're always inside. Down in the deep of my mind, trying so hard not to keep you, to keep you.
Testing 1 2. Hello ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages. I'm Grant Magic, dictator of the Virgan Republic. This is the Virgan radio service. The piece that you just listened to was Spectrum and Sarah Skinner, Keep You, an NCS release. Link is in the description if you want to check it out for yourself. Today with me I have the leader of what I believe is Urania.
That correct, Urania?
Mm.
The Principality of Urania, yes, indeed. Very happy to be here. After much time spent attempting to organise this, and I guess on top of it, we have finally arrived to answer all of your wonderful questions and to talk more about the wonderful nation that is the Principality of Urania. Absolutely a pleasure to be here.
Okay, yeah.
My apologies.
If I can just start with your name and the nation that obviously you represent at the moment.
So I am Her Royal Excellency Princess George I of the Principality of Urania, for whom I act as our sovereign.
Okay. So now we're gonna go into some questions about Urania, and
Absolutely.
we're gonna start off with what was the reason that Urania was founded? Why did you guys come into existence?
So it's a bit of a journey. So in late 2016, I wrote a paper on. I'd read an article about the Vatican City is what started it all off. The Vatican City, and it was an examination of the fact that the people who live in the Vatican are not Italian, they're not Roman, they're Catholic, which we don't traditionally consider to be its own ethnic group. We don't consider Catholics to make up their own ethnicity on par with, say, Americans, Germans, etc. And it got me thinking about which other minorities might fall into this category. And I ended up writing shortly afterwards a cited paper on asking the question as to whether or not it was necessary to have an LGBT nation on a similar prospect. Based on the belief, I think the findings were, if we presume that between 1 and 10% of people are gay, as that is what the suggestion has been made by some of the works such as Freud, less than 8% of them live in a country where they have full legal rights. Or at least they did at the time of my paper in 2016. That has changed marginally since. 8% of them, less than 56 million people globally. And this was quite a distressing fact. And so I'd written this entire paper that basically came to the conclusion that whilst it was largely a difficult thing to traverse, it was definitely necessary, and it sort of rested to one side until I came back to it a while later and realised that there was no course of action that had been taken, and it felt appropriate that the next course of action therein then would be to start such a nation. I don't quite have the finances I proposed in the original paper to offset the national debt of some Eurozone countries in return for the land necessary to start a nation yet, but small steps, one hopes.
Very, very good answer to that first question. Who runs Urania? Is the Senate, a Parliament, or an individual such as a dictator or a king?
Having the virtue of being both a student of politics originally and now a student of law for administrative systems, I found a great disdain for the American styles of senates and a great love for the British system of parliaments. And so we are a parliamentary system, actually very closely linked to, I suppose, the pre-modern UK Parliament, whereby we have a lower elected chamber, directly elected from the people, and then an upper chamber which consists of appointed, in our case, lords and ladies, etc., but would function similarly to the House of Lords in the UK. The only difference is our monarch acts as a head of state. This is where the lines begin to blur, I suppose. Our monarch is the acting head of state. I sit as the acting head of state therein. And ultimately the monarch holds the position of running the upper house, but the monarch is elected, I believe, according to our constitution, once every 6 months, based on the fact that to hold this position for life excellent would not particularly, I suppose, be in the interests of the movement, considering how the movement views life, I suppose. It's very much a youth-orientated culture, LGBT culture. So to hold something for life seemed most inappropriate.
Okay. And how does the government actually function? What is its day-to-day duties, and how does it get into the people, and you know?
Well, as currently, we are ruling as a government of one, being as despite the fact that I have approved multiple citizenship requests, some automatically, some via appeal, very few citizens currently seem particularly interested in actually getting involved, leading me, unfortunately, at this moment in time, to govern de facto through a state of emergency, just to pass laws with the absence of a parliament. In terms of day-to-day, the main day-to-day largely consists of drafting additional laws to further build the infrastructure as it goes forward. I think our most recent act was setting out, it was royal decree on the establishment of the Ives Cross, or the Order of Ives, as it were, as we felt that was an important thing to sort of gain attraction. But other things such as setting up laws on elections, etc. So currently, the current act, job of government at least, is to lay the foundations of the state, so that by the time people decide they want to start getting interested and involved, there is a proper framework for them to become involved in.
What has Urania achieved so far in its existence? I don't know if you've been around for long, but your Twitter account was created fairly recently, and I'm not sure if
Yes.
that has anything to do with your foundation.
Our Twitter account came shortly after the foundation. Unfortunately, It's a relatively young nation. We'll be coming up to 2.5 months soon, I believe. No, very, very young nation. As far as achievements go, I mean, beyond interacting with other LGBT youth groups, there was a small, although not publicized on Twitter, fundraiser for the ongoing crises in Chechnya for LGBT people. Admittedly, I think it was just over £50 or £60 raised, nothing major, but money nonetheless. I suppose that's realistically all we have achievements at the moment, but hopefully, as the year progresses, that should change again as more people come on board and more plans are set up, etc. And I said I look forward to interacting more and more with the community to focus on delivering those achievements.
Okay. And the next question was actually requested by the Queen Sadar of Sondaran. I still don't know how to pronounce that. So someone's got to teach me. You have in the past on your Twitter account claimed that you were the only LGBT nation. Perhaps you could clarify what you meant and why you claim that.
So, effectively, during the course of the paper, when I wrote it a couple of years ago, I extensively researched into historical examples on LGBT states that existed. There were a few examples. You have, during the 70s, the Stonewall Nation, as it was dubbed, which was a plan by activists in the US to move to a county in California, where you could have voting rights for the local council if you'd lived there 90 days. The idea was a mass exodus. They would elect all of themselves onto the council and set it up as its own independent commune, etc. Fails. You then have the next largest one is the Gay and Lesbian Kingdom of the Coral Sea Islands, which declares independence on Christmas Day 2004, I believe. I might be wrong on that. By declaring war on Australia. The conflict lasts a fortnight, I believe. I think Switzerland intermediated the declaration of war to the Prime Minister of Australia. But the Gay and the Gay and Lesbian Kingdom, rather, of the Coral Sea Islands, dissolved itself in 2017 as it was set up as a protest against Australian rules on LGBT rights. And so when the Marriage Equality Act was passed in Australia in 2017, they declared their work over. Whilst that was after my paper had been written, during the course of writing that paper, I was entirely unable to find any other proof of other exclusively LGBT nations, and since have been unable to find the same, as my intention was, if there was an existing project already, to jump on board that, but in the absence thereof, I was realistically forced to start. I'd seen nations purporting to be pro-LGBT rights, etc. I believe I was directed to the attention of one that was, I cannot bring it to mind now, I might be able to find it, that had been suggested as being pro-LGBT, etc., but I felt not quite in the same capacity. The aim of Urania is that realistically, Obsidia, it was proposed Obsidia, but Obsidia on further inspection I found was not primarily LGBT any more than it was progressive. And I found that to be a disingenuous use of, to be the LGBT nation. And so what you have is the consequential situation whereby realistically I have yet to see another nation pop up to claim to be it as the end goal for Urania. is to be an Israel, if you will, an LGBT Israel. A right of return for LGBT people by automatic requirement, and then for non-LGBT people, as I had a long spat through our official government Twitter account with some people about, for heterosexual or Dionian people therein. So that's the angle, and that's why we purport to be the only LGBT micronation. As unfortunately, I have yet to see substantial proof of any other states that are that inclined towards that being their end goal.
Okay. Are there any current happenings in Urania?
Yes, so we will be attending Student Pride in the UK in a fortnight's time with a couple of flags, with any luck at least, if we can get hold of some in time. If not, to promote the work that we've been doing. The hope is we've been working, I was personally very delighted to work with the Vital charity at a recent ball they had on fundraising for, was not LGBT causes, fundraising nonetheless, and so, but otherwise extensively. With such a small and such a sparse population, with I think 2/3 of our citizens living across the United States and the last third dotted around the UK, unfortunately, there isn't too much going on.
Okay. And just a last question about your nation. How can people get in contact with Urania?
So, as far as contact is concerned, if you are interested in contacting us regarding citizenship, etc., if you're looking for dual citizenship or to apply solely for the Uranian citizenship, you can apply via our website, which can be found on our Twitter, because it's in fact, I may have it right in front of me here at principality-of-urania-strike.webnode.com. Alternatively, you can email us via our official government at uraniangovernment@gmail.com, or finally you can get in touch via either of our Twitter accounts, either at Crown Urania or at Royal, with inquiries, etc. And we encourage people to reach out, be it for recognition from their states or involved with the state itself. We value interaction with others.
Okay. Let's move on to the community part of the show now.
Absolutely.
These are questions that are usually based on current happenings. In some shows I do like to ask about past happenings, but you haven't really been around as long to see every happening that I have, and that some nations that are watching right now have. So in your mind, what is your view of the community at the current moment?
The community I found to be quite interesting. It's a very broad church, and I'm still trying to sort of establish, because it's become very clear to me that there is certainly there are two types of micronations. There are micronations, the likes such as yourself. Others really ought to spring to mind when I make an example like this. Horrific preparation on my part. Cowsland, etc., Wakonga to an extent, sort of nations like that, New Westphalia, which sort of sit in one sort of echelon of states that are generally recognised. Makalos as well, generally recognised, generally interacted with. The more come to mind as I go on, it's not an exhaustive list. And then you have like a second set, the likes of Mesotopia, the likes of Pandaria, some of the more recent socialist ones that have popped up, that seem to be in a very, very different category as far as recognition and, I suppose, to some extent, seriousness goes. It seems to be that you have a very mixed group on those sort of states that are aiming to be akin to, like, Sealand, Molossus, etc., those kinds of nation-states, micronations, rather. And then those that seem to be a lot more fantasist or simulationist, and it's whether or not the community. I still can't figure out where the community seems to sit on that, unfortunately.
And the way it goes, the community, those of us who are not considered simulationists by other nations, and we all feel that simulationism is absolutely out of line, and that it's just plainly not acceptable. If you're going to tell some elaborate lie, then you best have the evidence to back that lie up, because it will absolutely not be tolerated by the rest of us.
Absolutely, and I think to an extent, part of it, I suppose, stems from how open this platform is. I mean, largely, a lot of this interaction is held via Twitter. Some nation states go all the way to having, their own Facebook pages, etc., YouTube presences, so on and so forth, such as yourself.
Yeah.
I think if the community, and it's the same, I suppose, when you see all these alliances pop up, if the community took the time to build a proper register is the wrong word, a proper caliber of nations that ought to be recognised, of proper official unions, group, coalitions, etc., that are recognised, etc. So you don't, the United Micronations, I have seen countless examples of everyone claiming to be the United Micronations. And until the community can establish which one it wants to have as the United Micronations, the whole concept will go. And until you can set up a regulatory perhaps is the wrong word in this community, but until you can set up an authoritative body, a body that sets, this is what it ought to be, this is the principle that we behind it shan't go anywhere. I mean, if you look at the existing United Nations, we're 195 nations recognised, and the nations that aren't on it don't tend to be recognised because they sit beyond it. Such as the League of Nations fell apart because nations left and right, and centre, and it wasn't taken seriously. Until the community can put itself in a position where it has those bodies that can take itself seriously because they have the weight of the community behind them, then until then, that's when simulationism is really going to be a problem.
See, I like that idea of sort of the registry, or some kind of caliber, or group of nations that do decide who's to be decided as a simulationist and like a realist. I've actually got people messaging me right now saying that they like this idea that you've suggested, but I do think there is one problem with the suggestion. It's not wrong. It's not a bad suggestion. It's an easily felt suggestion, but the main problem with it would be is who gets to head that kind of authority. And obviously every nation would vouch for themselves and say, I should totally be the head of this authority, and another nation would say, no, not you, me, and it would lead to a cycle of viciousness, and people saying, no, you shouldn't be this, but I should be this.
I think the way going forward, for example, looking at whether you have the Delusian Unitary Republic operate United Micronations, I believe. It seems like that. It wouldn't necessarily be. If you could get a plurality of states and number, there are more than enough of us that interact with each other, and you start to see this general list of good micronations and then others, Bandera, that if you could get a plurality behind it to agree that it is important that we have one standardized group that monitors this to act as our United Micronation, and then as a cross-national agreement there are more than enough micronational conferences that go on, but something where a working group was produced to draw up, and then fresh elections were held for chairperson, and if it was done properly with proper consensus across the board from a plurality of states, it would stand up on its own merit, and I reckon it would be very capable of putting down other states and movements that pop up claiming to be it. And I think then you'd start to get a sense of regularity, because ultimately the micronational stage is dominated by the fact that we are aspiring to macro states. We are aspiring to independent statehood. And to aspire to independent statehood, we must behave as independent states, and we must interact as independent states do. And to do that, we need an independent state body, such as a United Micronational body, that monitors that. And it needs to be established. It needs to be done properly. It needs to be sealed. And so I think it's certainly not a watertight idea, but it's an idea that, if done with a plurality of people across states, I think certainly has a lot of potential.
Yeah, you sound an awful lot like someone that I know quite well. But yeah, let's move on to the next question, which would be
Absolutely. I spent a lot of time on that one.
yeah, the recent Twitter outcry of hatred towards certain ideologies.
Yes,
There has been some recent outcry, specifically by a nation under the name Vexillum, who absolutely hates communism and socialism. I think that he's entitled to dislike it, but I don't think he has the right to maybe step on it and say, you know, it's all bad, and you know, communism has never done anything good, and that's absolutely not true. Everyone's ideology deserves to be respected, and obviously this certain individual has decided that it's not really acceptable for him to you know, respect people's ideologies. But go ahead with your answer.
I think to an extent you have to look at it, I suppose, in the frame of what international politics is. I mean, if the leader of a nation wishes to go ahead and criticize ideologies of their own state, then of course they're certainly not only welcome to, but qualified to. When it comes to ideologies on an international front, which is, face it, that's what this community is. It is an international front. It is one thing to have opinions counter on ideology. I mean, the last century alone has been a fantastic case study on why people can't agree on ideologies on an international front. And certainly states may choose not to interact with one another because of ideologies, but ultimately that shows more on the states themselves for their choice instead. I mean, during the Cold War, you have this fantastic group that set up, you know, the non-aligned, the third world as it was, the non-aligned, who considered themselves in neither camp, because they had that basic respect for it. And I suppose to an extent, that's where Urania, or at least as far as Urania under my governance, sits. I think I made a very interesting tweet a while ago regarding socialism. I realise now it probably was neither appropriate because it was not particularly in line with what Urania aims to do. But I think it is one thing certainly to have respect for ideologies. But if a state does have a disagreement with it, then, you know, let them air it. But it ought to be done properly, appropriately, and in a state-like manner. If a Twitter account wishes to devote itself to tweeting about the evils of ideology all day long, it will go the way that Hania did. You know, I appreciate it's a very egregious example to pull up. It is one thing to say, I don't like socialism, or one thing to say, I don't like, etc., or to condemn it, but to continue to go on about it, perhaps, is something that needs consideration on the part of whoever is tweeting as to why they need to go on about it so much. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, certainly it does. Next question. There has been a recent nation to join the Twitter sphere of micronationalism. That nation goes by the name of the Kingdom of Bandaria.
Yes.
They are harassing certain nations to join this.
The Council of Nations, I believe.
This Council of Nations. He's also
Council of Nations.
Yeah, he's also just adding people. It was made aware to me by an individual in the community who I regard with a very high respect, that he did apply to some sort of micronational organisation or some kind of United Micronations along those lines, and when they asked him to provide evidence of that he's not a simulationist, he could not do so, and that he decided to go off and make his own his own kind of thing.
Yeah.
This person who runs Bandaria claims to have a lot of ridiculous things including but not limited to the recognition from Kuwait and a 200,000 man army and a family in Saudi Arabia, and that he's the great grandson of some chieftain that lived about 150 years ago. What do you think of these claims and
I mean,
the fact that he can't produce evidence to back them up?
I mean, on the surface of it all, it's very clear. It's nothing serious going on. We were fortunate enough to tweet condemnation of Bandera a couple of days ago, and they misinterpreted it as support, and I think that sums up everything I had for that. But as you examine it further, I mean, if the person behind Bandera clearly has interest and intent, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the way, however, Bandera has gone about it is poor. We'll start with the 200,000 men army. I think that is clear nonsense. There is no substantial claim for that. It's entirely unreasonable. There are countries there are established macronations with armies smaller than that. I mean, Christ, the British army was that sized, I think, just before conscription ended. So just say a 200,000 man army, particularly to then claim that their claimed area is the vertebral triangle.
Bertawel, I believe it's between Egypt and Chad.
Yes, it's Egypt and Sudan. It's based on the disagreement over the 38th parallel. Is it the 38th parallel disagreement? Because it's the counterclaim to the Talib triangle. I mean, when pressed, the problem is that Pandaria clearly, upon interacting with Pandaria, it's very clear that there is a lack of understanding. I think one of the first interactions that we had with Bandera was they established, we have a permanent population in Bertawil, which is fundamentally untrue. Bertawil is largely untrue because Bertawil, which is named after a well, that's what Bertawil means. The well, as far as we are aware, was destroyed, or it is lost. It cannot be found. The population that are there currently are transient. They are known. And when pressed for this, I pointed out, there is no permanent population in Bertawil. It's nomad groups that sort of roam nearby. He went, yes, we're nomad. That's fine, but that's not a permanent population, and it's a lack of understanding, and it's why Urania, and particularly myself, encourage Bandera, if they're listening or become aware of this, to do some more reading. It's entirely fantasist. There's a promise there, and I can see clearly that there is the desire to be a respectable state, but it's not the way to go about it. Countless nations claim Bertawil, and yet it's seldom ever visited.
Yeah.
I mean, I think all of our current states effectively work on this very Vatican City style notion that we claim the immediate tiny area around us, and all of our citizens are far abroad and hail back to the motherland, our capitals. And yes, some nations claim more, some nations claim less. I mean, I think Obsidia is a rock. They claim a single transportable rock, all the way up to Molossia, which is this giant ranch out in Nevada. But what Bandara is doing is clearly fantasist, and I suppose on one note it ought to be ignored. But I think with some encouragement and some education, there is promise for Bandara. But I think it would be better for whoever is running Bandara to subsume into another micronation and perhaps learn the ropes like that, rather than jumping straight to setting up their own nation.
Yeah.
Which nation would take that buck is another matter, but yes, remains to be seen.
Yeah. I feel like I could recognise Bandera as a sovereign nation if they were to produce all these documents and all this kind of thing, these kind of things. Right now, I can't give them recognition because they're displaying signs of simulationism, and as I said earlier, it's not accepted.
Yeah, if it could be claimed, if it could be proven by Bandera that they are part of a transient population that was living in, or I suppose to an extent I will respect, around Bertawil, I would be significantly more inclined to recognise them.
Yeah,
because I can accept that. Everything else, clear bollocks, but give it to them. All my apologies, I didn't watch my language. Pardon me.
That's okay.
But if that's my main gripe, is the population notion. Countless countless nations claim Puerto Rico and will never, the people behind it will never visit it in their lifetime. If it could be proven that they claim it, I would be more inclined to recognise them. But they don't. Or at least not provably. And that's my greatest. Everything else is total nonsense and perhaps needs addressing additionally. But that population and the staking of that claim. I mean, Urania maintains a claim on a local fort, and I accept it is disputable on the grounds that we do not directly control it, and currently, based on our current situation, do not have the capacity to control it. And so I accept that that's a disputable claim, and I don't expect nations to recognise that. What I do expect nations to recognise is the claims for land for which I directly own, control, or inhabit, as well as the claims made by our respective government, etc., etc. I think that's really the policy which Pandaria, pardon, not Banda, ought to go forward with.
Very, very good, good answer. On to the next question. What can we as a collective do to stop the hatred of certain ideologies, and how can we tackle nations like Pandaria? If I can circle around to the whole ideology thing, obviously there is going to be hatred of certain ideologies, and Twitter is a free platform, but I don't feel like it should be acceptable. In my nation, I'm a dictator myself, so what I say goes. But I feel like this should people should be able to put a cap on the amount of things that people can say. So what would you do about the hatred of ideology and this nation Bandaria? How can we combat both these things?
I think I should address Bandera first, because Bandera is a slightly, I suppose, easier one to address. The likes of nations such as Bandera, and there is another which doesn't come to mind. Their king had a court appearance coming up. I cannot remember which they were. Entirely fantasy, serial fantasy. Nations like that need to be addressed. Possibly. Nations like that need to be addressed with education. I say education, but they need to be. It needs to be pointed out to them what is wrong and suggested how they can move forward to correct it. Because, as I said, there is promising ideas, and there's people that certainly want to be involved in a community that have causes close to their heart that micronations would benefit, but it needs to be done properly. Otherwise, it undermines the community. So, education there, and perhaps, as I said, if I suppose it goes all the way back, if you are able to set up a proper micronational body, the likes of a United Micronations, recognised by a plurality of proper, air quotes, micronations, then you can put restrictions on how one becomes eligible to join that. That also will encourage states like Bandari to buck their ideas up and fall into line. As for ideology, as said, I'm a very firm believer in the concept of manifest destinies. Perhaps is the wrong term. The rights of states to manifest their own destiny, at least internally. If a nation has a problem with an ideology, internally, so be it. Unless it breaks any conventions or treaties that they are held to, be it by a regional body or treaties with other nations, if they are acting legally as far as the international community and their own national law is concerned, that is perfectly acceptable. Whether or not I agree with it is a different matter, and whether or not I or the nation I belong to, etc., shall comment about that, different matter. As far as hatred of ideologies of other nations, it comes down to dialogue. I think Sir Humphrey Appleby in Yes Minister puts it very clearly that the UN is the accepted forum for the expression of international hatred. And whilst certainly I would not encourage a united micronational body to become the accepted forum for the expression of international hatred, I would encourage it to be the perfect forum to have debates on ideology. It is one thing, as said, to criticise a nation for its ideology. We see it in mainstream news all the time, particularly hardline nations such as some of the more authoritarian dictatorships in the world, like North Korea, Iran, to an extent China, etc., have this nation is wrong, or that way of living is wrong, and that's it happens. But when it becomes, and it's very easy to toe the line over into this, when it becomes a Twitter account 24/7 tweeting about how evil socialism is or how wrong fascism is, and please don't take that as a defense of either socialism or fascism. When a Twitter account becomes only tweeting about how evil an ideology is, how wrong it is, then you need to ask yourself whether or not that is really appropriate for a state. And at that point, you need to start asking questions about whether or not that's a statement that ought to be recognised. Perhaps a code of conduct that states agree to adhere by on Twitter might be worthwhile, but again, it all comes back to the community coming together in a plurality to agree on what they want to do and how to go forward. Because ultimately, this is a community that will ever grow. At no wish to belittle what this community is, as Bandera is fantastic proof. Anybody with an email account can open a Twitter account, and anybody with a Twitter account can create their own nation. And so when this is a community that is constantly growing, constantly evolving, dozens of new nations popping up all the time, until the established nations, until the plurality of, again, quote, proper nations, established nations, formulated nations come together to agree enough is enough, or this is what needs to happen, nothing will change. It is down to the community to come together to take action on these things. Again, very rambly answer. I'm terribly sorry for that.
That's
Non-stop.
okay. That's fine. It's fine. The last question on my list here, and then we will move on to questions by the live audience. The last question here is, what does Urania want to achieve in the community?
Was that what would I like to achieve in the community?
Yeah. What would you like to achieve with Urania and the community? What can you hope for people to?
As far as my hopes for Urania, Urania finds its name. We had this tiny little conversation before we get named after Uranus. Almost. It's taken from Karl Ulrichs, a 19th century German lawyer, who wrote these very long series of notes. Verschwörung über das Ratio der menschlichen Liebe, the research into the riddle of male love, where he outlines Uranian men who are Uranian, to be attracted to one another. It comes from Aphrodite Urania, who created out of Uranus testicles, but I shan't get too much into that. And Ulrichs was a pioneer for gay rights, and subsequently his ideas of Uranianism. You have the Society of Chironier, set up in the late 19th century with the likes of George Cecil Ives, Oscar Wilde, etc., to promote the cause, the mission. And I hope to continue that with Urania, that Urania becomes a body, a vessel, to further promote and further LGBT rights and to bring causes to light. I appreciate we don't quite have the clout of some macronations, but we certainly try to keep abreast on issues such as the current crisis in Chechnya. And that's what I hope for Urania, is to continue to educate. I mean, I've had more than enough conversations on Twitter, both my own personal account and the government account, with people who have discovered events or discovered things such as what is going on through Chechnya through our work. And that's wonderful. That's a very uplifting feeling to think that I'm helping to educate. That's what I want Urania to be going forward, to educate and provide solutions. As far as the community, and what I would like to do in the community, I suppose I've hinted at a lot. I would like to see the community move towards a more standardized respect. Respectable is the wrong word. The establishment of things like a proper, recognized, united micronations. And so, for example, a code of conduct. I would hope and I would like to work in the community going forward with other states, cross-national, etc., cross-ideology, cross-belief, to establish a body that serves, because ultimately, for those of us who are established, it's very, very bold of me to imply Urania is as established as some other states, but for those of us that are, it's damaging to the community when stimulationist nations or nations that take it far too far, and Bandaria, again, to a lesser extent, Haina, it damages the community because it looks bad on the rest of us. If the community is able to come together, and that's what I'd like to do, to set up a standardized way of doing things, as current macronations do, then I would be very happy with something like that.
Okay. And now if we could go on to questions from the live chat.
Absolutely.
So the first question comes from New Westphalia. Is there a specific etymology to do with the name Urania? I think you did answer this.
Yes, so yeah, you have. Well, Ulrichs was German. He was born in the Kingdom of Hanover in the early 19th century. He wrote in German. It was Erning, but it translates into English Uranian. And you do have a small group of poets, the likes of Lord Douglas, Bosie, and Oscar Wilde, who describe themselves as Uranian. Uranian is the English. Ulrichs proposes the alternative for heterosexuals to be taken from Aphrodite Dionia, sexual gender, but his papers don't discuss that too much, as that was not the focus of his study. But that is the etymology of Urania, taken from Aphrodite, Urania, at least by Greeks it was. It also is notably Uranian is almost an allusion to Plato's Symposium, discussion on Eros, which was love, and that is why that was carried throughout. But I cannot profess to have read Ulrich's work too in or too much more in depth, perhaps, to discuss that properly.
Okay. I hope that answers your question, New Westphalia. The next question comes from Roostra. Believe that would be the president of Winona. But do you have any plans for infrastructure, such as planning to build any buildings, roads, power, etc.? Or will you be operating based on the current systems?
So currently, I, as the legislative sovereign of Urania, have no personal agenda for additional construction, for additional infrastructure to be built, as the current existing infrastructure within our claims is perfectly fine. I mean, I have repaired a door. I suppose we could consider that to be some sort of infrastructure change. But I think it's very much about living.
Sounds like a reasonable infrastructure. Yeah.
Well, I suppose. I think it's something about to exist within the means, as it were. I don't particularly govern over a territory large enough to appropriately make too many more extensions. And I don't necessarily have the access to resources to do so either. So perhaps in future, but as of this current moment, I have to do so. But that may change in due time.
Okay. And the last question from the live chat comes from the Highland People's Republic. Opinions on the libertarian American Republic. Do you believe Libertalia will be successful, or will members of the community prevent them from progressing?
Libertalia, yes. Am I correct to say this is the successor to Valm, or am I possibly
No, this would be the successor to the organization, the USSR.
Yes.
Yes,
it has the potential. It certainly has the potential to. But again, I think the Libertarian American Republic has to be cautious in making sure that, as I continue to go with it, needs to make sure that it becomes a proper it needs to be the body for socialism, as it were. I've seen a handful of. I cannot profess to understand whether it is true, and I think Pandaria had suggested that it had support from Libertalia, and that's not an indictment on Libertalia, but I think it, just as long as it is careful that it is not engaging with simulationist nations, and it keeps a high standard for itself and its member republics, it should certainly be very successful, I believe. It's just, again, about setting out a standard and adhering to that standard and being the benchmark for that standard.
Okay. Well, I mean, if there's no if there's no other questions from the live audience, I mean, I will give them a minute. I'll give a minute to the live audience if there's any more questions.
Absolutely. So I do invite any.
Do you have any burning questions for myself?
I do not particularly. I suppose, as an open question to the audience, it seems to be the point we have discussed the most. Would there be appetite? And I've asked this before on the personal Twitter of Her Majesty, or Her Royal Excellency, rather, goodness gracious, can't even stick to my own styles of address, as to whether or not there would be the appetite for setting up a proper, to be the benchmark, United Micronational. Because this is the problem, is that I find the community, there are, cliques is the wrong word, but you have groups that recognise each other more than others, and I think without state, I just question as to whether or not, to suppose to the audience, whether or not there is the appetite for a cross-national investigation into the establishment of a proper United Micronation. Although I appreciate I can't answer it in time because of limitations of my own. See the responses.
Okay.
Perhaps that was a flat response.
There's just one question that I have for you before we do finish off. There has been a reply from the Highland People's Republic. Libertalia does not have interaction with Bandaria. Bandaria is a lie. We are currently attempting to cut communications with them. My question for you is, why is the head of state are you referred to as Princess George instead of Prince George or King George or anything else?
Well, so in keeping, I established, with the establishment of Urania, the intention was to stay as true to LGBT culture, particularly classical LGBT culture, as I call it, that sort of pre 20th century, or the first half of the 20th century before, sort of prior to Stonewall. Because you see in the as far as current LGBT culture is concerned, it largely revolves around you have Stonewall in the US, and then a series of protests across the UK, the Wolverhampton Report. And I personally prefer to focus Urania around the more classical aspects. But in tradition with the drag performers, particularly of old and to an extent still now, who addressed each other by the opposite pronouns, as it was more addressing the character rather than the person beneath the character, I found it was most appropriate and most fitting to the pronouns, at least for the styles of address, as it felt most appropriate in an homage, if that goes any way to helping to explain that.
That's a very good answer. The last thing I want to do is read out a series of replies from New Westphalia on the topic of setting standards.
Absolutely.
New Westphalia says, I think the issue with forming a standard is that there are too many individuals, groups that have too much in terms of personality. There's too many people that want to be in charge and running running the most of everything they can get their hands on. Their own positions would be that theirs is the standard. It's impossible to enforce with so many UMs and organisations that group together.
I certainly see the merit in that, and I think it's certainly true that there is a plethora of United Micronations, which undermines efforts to set the one true United Micronation. But I think, the interaction between, the United Micronations and setting a standard is only as developed as the people who wish to adhere to it wish to make it. It could be a very basic standard, as we see, just, non-simulationism, etc. It might be a very developed standard. I think, however, if states are prepared to compromise, and again, I think it comes down to that plurality. Westphalia and I perhaps disagree, but it comes down to where you can enforce that plurality, who are prepared to make compromise on setting out a body that aims to establish, because ultimately, United Micronation, if nothing else, it doesn't need to be a legislative body. What it acts as is a recognised register of who micronations are, and theoretically would make it far easier for micronations to properly establish themselves and to promote their own position, make it easier to understand who they need to recognise, etc., because through the weight of its own reputation, it would provide legitimacy to member states, and I think that is something that needs to be examined certainly, Westphalia makes some fantastic points about the shortcoming of such a body.
Mm-hmm.
But in the absence of finding, perhaps, in the absence, I suppose, of finding that middle ground, I suppose it is about conversation and dialogue. But as I said, I agree, except perhaps that Westphalia may disagree.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's been no other questions from the live audience. So I'm gonna end it off here. Princess George.
Excellent. Well, it has been an absolute pleasure. I have been more than happy to do it.
It's been very, very good and very. I've enjoyed this conversation. It's been very intellectual.
Not to worry, I'd happily do it all again.
Thanks for appearing on this week's episode. So next week I was meant to be having on a nation called the Kingdom of Mass. Unfortunately, I will no longer be hosting them, and I will be moving everyone who's already applied and everyone who's already got a definite show up by 1 week. So next week you can catch me with the Highlands People's Republic and the state of Burlington. Join me for that next week. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Again, Princess George, absolute pleasure having you on. Thanks everyone for watching tonight, and that's.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's it.